-40 degrees. The thick, ancient Siberian taiga stood frozen in a perpetual icy stupor. It was a desolate, terrifying place where time itself seemed to have slowed its measured pace, surrendering unconditionally to the crushing, inescapable dominion of a brutal winter. The heavy, completely frozen wooden doors of a seemingly endless, serpentine line of freight train cars, heavily covered with a thick, unbreakable crust of packed snow, slid open with a deafening, clanking metallic roar. The grinding screech of rusted iron rolled over the tops of the frozen pine trees for miles, violently shattering the pristine, ringing silence of this remote, God-forsaken land at the very edge of the civilized world. It served as a grim announcement of the arrival of a new, desperate human cargo. The Soviet convoy guards, wrapped up to their very eyes in stiff sheepskin coats that severely restricted their movements and made them look like lumbering bears, nervously racked the freezing metal bolts of their rifles with numb, bleeding fingers. Their hot, ragged breath instantly crystallized in the dead air, settling as a prickly, heavy white frost on their eyebrows and the raised collars of their military greatcoats. Large, highly trained guard dogs choked on their own fierce, primal barking, aggressively pulling their cracking leather leashes to the absolute breaking point. They left deep, ragged claw trenches in the densely packed snow, their muzzles foaming with professionally trained aggression. The tension in the freezing air was so thick it could be cut with a trench knife. The entire Soviet guard detail was stretched to the limit, like a single exposed, painfully throbbing nerve, grimly expecting to see the usual soul-draining picture. They braced themselves for a moaning, physically exhausted, disease-ridden crowd of completely broken prisoners, driven utterly mad by the bone-chilling cold, the cramped darkness, and severe, prolonged starvation. They expected men entirely stripped of their human dignity, who would right now, obeying only the blind, desperate animal instincts of basic survival, begin to chaotically tumble out straight into the deep, burning snow. The guards mentally prepared for wild, animalistic screams, foul curses, weeping, and ruthless fistfights over a fleeting spot of warmth or a discarded frozen crust of bread. But instead of this predictable, degrading human chaos, a mystical, heavy silence suddenly hung over the snow-covered railway platform, shrouded in swirling morning fog. It was a silence so profound, so unnatural and eerie, that cold shivers ran down the spines of even the most hardened, combat-weary frontline veterans holding the loaded rifles. Out of the pitch-black, frozen depths of the wooden freight cars, where the internal temperature was barely a few degrees different from the killing cold outside, people stepped out into the crackling frost in absolute, majestic, statuesque silence. Without a single rough, commanding shout from the bewildered Soviet guards, without any cruel, driving blows from heavy rifle butts to their hunched shoulders, they smoothly, almost ghost-like, descended onto the treacherous ice. Instantly, flawlessly, as if obeying a telepathic, silent signal from an unseen commander, they aligned themselves into perfect, endless military formations. In a matter of mere seconds, a 1,000-man crowd, deeply exhausted by an agonizing railway journey across the entire continent, brutal starvation, and complete uncertainty about their future, transformed into perfectly aligned rows of silent, breathing ice statues. They did not utter a single moan or a pathetic sound of physical complaint. These were not just broken, defeated prisoners of a lost war. These were the elite, deeply ideological, fiercely loyal soldiers of a once great imperial army. Men who brought their ancient, ironclad samurai code of honor straight into the icy, merciless heart of the Soviet Union. Welcome to the Living Word channel. Settle in as we dive headfirst into an incredible documentary chronicle of our shared, complex past, hidden beneath silent, snowy layers of time. It was the dark, momentous year of 1945. After long, agonizing years of monstrous human suffering, endless rivers of spilled tears, and millions upon millions of violently shattered human destinies, the last destructive artillery salvos of the Second World War had faded away into the smoke-filled pages of history. The entire wounded world, smoking in apocalyptic ruins from the cratered cities of Europe to the burnt, ash-covered islands of the Pacific, froze in a deafening silence. Humanity painfully tried, through a thick veil of sorrow, to comprehend the mind-boggling scale of the global catastrophe that had just occurred. After the historic, deeply humiliating signing of the act of unconditional surrender of the Japanese Empire on the cold metal deck of an American battleship, colossal, seemingly endless masses of entirely foreign people suddenly found themselves stranded on the scorched, deeply traumatized territory of the Soviet Union. Over 1 million Japanese soldiers and career officers of the formidable, legendary Kwantung Army, men who had once inspired paralyzing terror throughout all of Asia and who were widely considered fanatically invincible by their own culture, forever laid down their well-oiled weapons. Silently, with tightly clenched jaws and dark, unfathomable eyes looking stoically into the void, they bowed their heads before the stern, battle-weary, victorious Soviet forces. Japan, having been a highly disciplined and extremely dangerous military ally of the Axis powers for many uncompromising years of global conflict, was forced, under the punitive conditions of post-war political agreements, to send its captured soldiers as free slave labor to physically rebuild the devastated national economy of the massive, victorious country, which was suffocating in grief, widows' tears, and crippling nationwide poverty. Long, groaning trains of wooden freight cars, appearing absolutely endless in the oppressive winter haze, moved with a dull, doomed clatter of heavy iron wheels over the joints of frozen steel rails. They carried these stateless, defeated men further and further away from their native, warm, volcanic islands. Inside these dark, freezing, windowless boxcars, smelling of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and despair, the profound, silent psychological drama of an entire nation was unfolding in the pitch dark. With every heavy, rhythmic rotation of the rusted wheels, they were forever saying a heartbreaking goodbye to the delicate, aesthetic sight of gently blooming spring cherry blossoms falling in the wind. They were leaving behind the soothing, salty whisper of their native Pacific Ocean crashing against rocky shores, and the 1,000-year-old, highly refined way of their measured, traditional life centered around family and duty. Relentlessly, day after day, week after agonizing week, they were plunging straight into the brutally cold heart of an alien land, breathing a lung-freezing frost, a land absolutely hostile and diametrically opposed to their deeply refined Eastern mentality. They were systematically distributed and held in strictly guarded, heavily fortified correctional labor camps, scattered across the most remote environments up until the mid-1950s. They were sent to the Soviet Far East with its treacherous, bone-chilling climate that bred pneumonia, and to the boundless, untamed, primeval Siberia, frightening in its deeply lonely scale, where a man could walk for months and see no living soul. They were pushed into the ancient, mineral-rich Ural Mountains, blown through by piercing, relentless, howling winds that cut through the thickest clothing like invisible razors. Everywhere across this intimidating geography, where strong, desperate working hands were critically needed for the physical resurrection of an exhausted, starving country, gloomy wooden barracks, hastily nailed together from raw timber, sprouted like poisonous mushrooms after a cold rainstorm. They were densely surrounded by high, impenetrable fences of biting barbed wire, and crowned with towering wooden guard towers equipped with heavy machine guns and blinding searchlights that violently cut through the depressive polar nights. It was precisely there, in the middle of absolute frozen nowhere, that yesterday's proud, highly disciplined warriors, trained from their impressionable youth in the uncompromising art of killing without hesitation or remorse, engaged in the heaviest, physically exhausting penal logging and construction operations. Using rusted two-handed metal saws that required perfect rhythm and agonizing effort, they felled gigantic, centuries-old Siberian pine and cedar trees, standing waist-deep in the collapsing taiga snow, their undernourished muscles screaming in sheer, tearing agony. They descended via terrifying, creaking wooden elevators into damp, mortally dangerous subterranean coal mines that constantly groaned and threatened to collapse, burying them alive in heavy, toxic, coal dust-filled air that turned their spit black. They punched through the unyielding, permafrost-frozen taiga with heavy metal pickaxes that sent agonizing shockwaves up their freezing arms to painfully lay new transport arteries and rail lines. They built massive architectural wooden bridges over swift, freezing rivers with black, swirling currents, strong enough to instantly knock a grown man off his feet and drag him forever under the unbreakable ice. They also took the most direct, back-breaking part in the massive physical reconstruction of major Soviet cities that had been ruthlessly bombed and turned into pulverized dust. Daily, brick by heavy brick, they transformed depressing piles of broken stone, shattered glass, and twisted, burnt metal into functional residential neighborhoods for the surviving, traumatized civilian population trying to start their lives anew. The commanding officer of one of these particularly isolated, highly secured Siberian camps, located as far as physically possible from any hint of civilization or basic comfort, was a man named Alexei Voronov. He carried an incredibly heavy, internally broken, and deeply tormented destiny. This was a man who had walked on foot through the entirety of the meat-grinding war in the very hell of the front-line infantry, from the piercing alarm bell in June of 1941 to the joyful yet tear-filled end in May. He had seen, in his short lifetime, so much unbearable human grief, twisted suffering, rivers of innocent blood, and haunting losses that his once bright grey eyes seemed irrevocably faded, completely emptied of any warm light by the psychological horror he had witnessed firsthand on the battlefields. Alexei already had complex, daily, nerve-wracking, ulcer-inducing experience working with foreign prisoners of war in various other holding facilities across the ruined country. He had personally seen arrogant, ideologically driven, and then pitifully broken, weeping Germans begging for mercy. He had seen cunning, profit-seeking Romanians trying to trade trinkets for food, violently shivering Italians cursing the cold, and fiercely silent Hungarians harboring deep resentment. He was far too accustomed, through his own bitter, grinding practical experience, to the undeniable fact that any prisoner of war camp is always an uncontrollable, boiling, highly dangerous, infectious chaos. It was a literal powder keg, ready to violently explode at any given minute over a single crust of stale bread or a torn blanket. In his deeply cynical, soldierly understanding, forged in the trenches, prisoners were always completely broken, morally crushed people who had entirely lost their human shape, their dignity, and any shred of male pride. He believed they inevitably transformed into cornered, desperate beasts, driven only by the agonizing emptiness of their stomachs and the drive to live one more day. This grim reality meant constant, suicidal attempts at daring escapes into the freezing taiga, which invariably ended in a miserable, lonely death from the cold or the tearing fangs of pursuit dogs. It meant cowardly, rat-like, degrading petty thefts from their own dying comrades who were too sick to defend their meager rations. It meant brutal, animalistic fights with sharpened, rusty shivs or bare knuckles over a blackened potato in the freezing mud. It meant constant, humiliating, tearful begging for food from the passing, well-fed Soviet guards, entirely devoid of any pride, accompanied by pathetic pleas for mercy, crawling on their knees in the cold autumn mud. It meant a complete, catastrophic lack of any internal organization, camaraderie, and self-discipline. That is precisely why, anticipating the highly stressful arrival of a new, massive Japanese contingent, whose frightening fanaticism, absolute disregard for personal death, and terrifying cruelty were the subject of whispered rumors among the Soviet troops, Alexei Voronov internally shrank into a defensive, paranoid spring. He seriously, in a heavy-handed fashion, prepared his men for bloody riots, highly organized disobedience, open sabotage at the vital work sites, mass ritual suicides to avoid the shame of forced labor, and bloody uprisings. He knew the suppression of such events would inevitably require the use of lethal firearms, heavy machine guns, and brute physical force. But the sobering, stunning, completely unexpected reality far exceeded his wildest expectations, and forever, down to its very philosophical foundation, overturned his cynical frontline worldview and his deep understanding of human resilience. Among the thousands of these skeletal people, frozen to the marrow of their fragile bones, silently stepping off the train onto the wind-swept, desolate platform, one man stood out immediately. From the very first freezing seconds, he commanded absolute, unquestioned attention without uttering a single word or making a threatening gesture. It was a Japanese career officer named Hiroshi Tanaka. His thin, out-of-season, light cotton summer military uniform was frayed into gaping holes from the grueling journey. Deep, bruised shadows lay on his high-cheekboned, yellowish face from chronic starvation and the bone-crushing fatigue of the rattling road. But his back was flawlessly, impossibly straight, like the taut steel string of a finely tuned instrument, refusing to bend to the harsh environment. His deep, calculating gaze was completely calm, impenetrably cold, and supremely focused entirely on the unfolding grim reality around him, analyzing every detail, every guard, every exit. In his dark, almond-shaped, bottomless eyes, there was not a single drop of animal fear, not a hint of rising panic, despair, or weak fawning before the heavily armed victors holding loaded rifles in their thickly gloved hands. He observed the Soviet guards not as masters, but as temporary captors in the long, unfolding, philosophical wheel of his personal and national karma. Alexei Voronov watched with daily growing, almost reverent amazement as this starving, freezing Japanese man, with just one elegant, highly controlled gesture of a hand clad in a hole-ridden glove, forced hundreds of his subordinate, equally starving soldiers to instantly freeze at the rigid position of military attention. With just one strict, wordless, commanding look, he ensured they dared not utter a single sound or shift their weight from one freezing foot to another in the crackling -40-degree frost. Problems with Japanese prisoners of war in the merciless, deadly conditions of the Soviet Union arose hundreds of times less frequently than with representatives of any other European countries that had passed through the heavy iron gates of these remote camps. Discipline. This was the most important defining word that invariably, with sincere, undeniable, almost grudging respect, came to the mind of every strict Soviet guard, demanding foreman or highly educated civil engineer who had to work side by side with them on the dangerous construction sites and in the perilous forests. These men, direct blood descendants of honorable samurai warriors, were literally raised from birth in the strictest centuries-old traditions of absolute, unquestioning submission to their superiors, boundless respect for hierarchy, and sacred, unwavering duty to their emperor. They were distinguished by a fantastic, superhuman level of deep internal self-organization, wholly unattainable and largely incomprehensible for the pragmatic, emotionally driven European understanding. They strictly, without the slightest hesitation, without a shadow of internal doubts or rebellious whispered attempts to dispute a harsh, seemingly unfair order, observed a flawless army subordination, even in the most unbearable, degrading conditions of Siberian captivity. The devastating loss of their beautiful homeland, the shocking, world-ending collapse of a supposedly invincible divine empire, the constant, maddening hunger twisting their empty stomachs into paralyzing spasms, the frost piercing to the very marrow, day after day, silently taking the fragile lives of their sick comrades in the night. Nothing from this living, endless white nightmare could break their internal iron core, tempered and forged in years of fierce, bloody battles across the Pacific theater. They remained a single, highly functional, deeply united army, even without deadly weapons in their hands, armed only with their unshakable philosophy and collective, unbreakable will. Alexei Voronov very quickly, within the first few weeks of intense, wary observation of their routines, realized one paradoxical, mind-bending thing that freed him and his men from a crushing burden of stress and guard duties. He and his heavily armed guards absolutely did not need to police these silent, stoic people from the inside, wasting their shattered nerves on maintaining basic order in the overcrowded barracks. The Japanese rank-and-file soldiers continued to unquestioningly, faithfully, religiously obey their own Japanese career officers, such as the unyielding, iron-willed Hiroshi Tanaka. The strict, pyramid-like, absolute hierarchy of the Imperial Army, built and refined over centuries of feudal history and warfare, continued to exist invisibly, but very powerfully and incredibly effectively behind the rusty Soviet barbed wire, dictating every single aspect of their captive, bleak daily lives. Early in the howling Siberian morning, when the icy metal of the wooden barrack door handles, heavily covered with thick white frost, adhered dead to bare human hands, violently tearing the skin off if pulled too quickly without gloves, the Japanese stepped out onto the desolate parade ground. The Soviet convoy guard no longer needed to run through the freezing, foul-smelling barracks, tearing his vocal cords, shouting vile curses, threatening with the deadly isolation of the punishment cell, and forcing half-asleep, weeping people out into the frost by sheer, brutal physical force. It was enough to simply, quietly approach without unnecessary emotion or hostility, and say in a calm, working conversational tone to the Japanese commander exactly how many men were needed today for dangerous labor at the remote logging site or in the lung-destroying stone quarry. Hiroshi Tanaka, silently, with unchanging, aristocratic, unshakable inner dignity that never cracked, would take a measured, confident step forward from the rigid formation. He would issue a short, chopped, guttural, sharp command in his native language, sounding like the precise, whistling strike of a katana sword cutting through the air. The strictly defined, exact detachment would instantly, with the frightening mechanical precision of a Swiss watch, separate from the main mass of prisoners, forming a perfect new square ready to march to their grueling labor, their faces devoid of complaint. No one tried to cowardly, selfishly hide behind the broad backs of their stronger comrades to avoid the day's toil. No one fell to their knees in the deep snow and simulated a severe illness, clutching their stomach or faking a limp to sit out the freezing day in the relative, smoky warmth near the smoldering iron barrack stove. All administrative, logistical functions for the relentless control over the observance of the camp regime, for the maximally fair, equitable distribution, meticulously calculated to the very last crumb of bread and drop of watery soup, of the life-saving portions of government food, for maintaining sterile, hospital-like cleanliness in the sleeping barracks. All of this was absolutely voluntarily, by unspoken, highly effective mutual agreement of both sides, transferred entirely to their own native, respected commanders, who ruled with absolute, unquestioned authority. This perfectly coordinated, frictionless internal organization amazed the imagination of the cynical, war-hardened Soviet guards, who thought they had seen every possible kind of human degradation and weakness. Hiroshi Tanaka never, under any circumstances, even the most exhausting ones where a man might break, raised his voice at his starving, freezing soldiers. It was enough for him simply to walk up in terrifying silence and look with a long, piercing, heavy, soul-crushing gaze straight into the eyes of a man guilty of some trivial infraction, such as a poorly tied bootlace or a moment of hesitation. This unbearably heavy, silent gaze forced an experienced man, a hardened veteran covered in battle scars, to turn pale with crushing, overwhelming shame and bow deeply from the waist in a sign of the most profound, absolute repentance and total submission to the collective will. For them, deeply steeped in the ancient philosophy of Bushido, losing their true face before a superior in rank, showing cowardly faint-heartedness, selfishness, or momentary weakness even here, in this hopeless, freezing, icy desert thousands of miles away from their blooming native home, was 100 times worse than severe physical pain, the dark isolation of the punishment cell, or death itself. This silent, proud, unbroken, monumental dignity of defeated warriors forced even the camp commanders of the Soviet Union, deeply hardened and traumatized by the merciless war against fascism, to feel an involuntary, deep, and profound human respect toward their recent blood enemies, recognizing a warrior spirit that could not be caged. But the long, endless, unforgiving winter in the boundless, sprawling taiga does not forgive people even the slightest, fleeting weakness or mistake. It ruthlessly, systematically freezes the living soul, turns warm breath into sharp ice, settling deep in the vulnerable lungs, and turns the simplest routine daily action into an exhausting, desperate battle for physical survival against the raw elements. The thick, boot-sucking, heavy mud of the autumn thaw was rapidly, almost overnight, replaced by stone-hard, blinding white snowdrifts higher than a tall man's height, turning the camp's entire territory into a deadly, howling, unforgiving desert where the wind never stopped. And in these unbearable, primeval, freezing conditions, the Japanese prisoners demonstrated something that plunged the experienced native Soviet guards into a real, profound, mind-altering cultural shock that they would recount for the rest of their lives. Cleanliness. In distant, tradition-bound Japan, personal hygiene had always, over many centuries of deep cultural evolution, been at an unattainable, almost religious level, elevated to an absolute, uncompromising, mandatory cult of purity. It was a foundational part of their ancient philosophy, a part of their respectful, harmonious attitude toward the unseen spirits of nature, and the fundamental purity of their own inner selves. And contrary to highly exaggerated, politically motivated Western misconceptions about the prison system, basic sanitary hygiene in the harsh Soviet camps at that time was also carefully, strenuously, and strictly monitored by the administration to prevent devastating, uncontrollable outbreaks of terrifying, deadly epidemics of typhus, cholera, and dysentery, which could easily mow down people by the thousands in unventilated quarters. Strictly, without any exceptions, once a week, the entire lice-ridden contingent of prisoners was mandatorily taken to a hot, wood-fired, steam-filled, crowded bathhouse, and their meager, filthy clothing was heavily roasted in high-temperature disinfection chambers to kill the ever-present parasites. But for the Japanese, this strictly regulated, basic weekly norm was catastrophically, physically, and spiritually wholly insufficient to maintain their sense of self. They, frankly, openly, and frighteningly surprised the stern camp administration with their fanatical, completely ineradicable, obsessive striving for absolute, ideal bodily cleanliness, no matter the harsh external environment or weather conditions. Even mortally exhausted by heavy physical labor in the freezing woods, dropping off their feet from incredible, mind-numbing fatigue, screaming joint pain, and chronic sleep deprivation, they used absolutely any, the tiniest, seemingly impossible and painful opportunity to bring their emaciated, dirty bodies into proper, pristine order. Alexei Voronov, wrapping himself tightly in his windproof sheepskin coat and nursing a rare, precious cup of hot tea, often watched the exact same surreal, mesmerizing, completely illogical picture from the heavily frosted window of his warm office in the early, dark, unforgiving mornings. It was a picture that completely defied the logic of a normal, self-preserving, freezing person. Outside, there was a crackling, deadly white frost of -30, and sometimes even -40 degrees. An icy, relentless, howling northern wind, piercing to the very bones, ruthlessly burned the exposed face like hot fire, making eyes water involuntarily and instantly freezing the tears to the raw red cheeks. And near the open, exposed cast-iron water pumps, heavily encrusted with thick blue ice, with ice-cold, freezing water that immediately cramped muscles in agonizing, sharp spasms the moment it touched the skin. Japanese soldiers stood absolutely calmly, motionless, breathing evenly, like timeless stone statues of Buddha in a snowy, silent temple garden. Absolutely unashamed of the bewildered and sometimes frankly shocked, wide-eyed looks of the surrounding Soviet guards in their heavy winter gear, and completely, utterly ignoring the bone-chilling, lethal cold that was viciously biting into their exposed skin, threatening frostbite, they calmly, methodically, without any unnecessary fuss, hesitation, or shivering, stripped off their rags to the waist. From their excessively thin, skeletal bodies, where every single rib was painfully visible, covered with old, jagged, healed combat scars and fresh, bruised purple abrasions from carrying heavy logs, a thick, billowing white steam billowed rapidly into the frosty, still air, just like from a large, boiling iron kettle on a hot stove. Snorting loudly, rhythmically, and rubbing themselves vigorously with their rough, callus-covered, bleeding, frost-bitten hands, methodically, not missing a single centimeter of skin, they washed themselves with this icy, freezing water. They vigorously, almost violently, scrubbed off the sticky, cold sweat of fear, the deeply ingrained pine resin, and the pervasive, oily coal dust from the deep mines. Officer Hiroshi Tanaka always, without a single exception, set a personal, flawless example for his exhausted, watching soldiers, proving that the spirit commands the flesh. Every single morning, absolutely regardless of any raging, howling blizzard, dense, blinding snowfall, or a vicious snowstorm strong enough to physically knock a grown man off his feet, he walked out to the heavily iced-over cast-iron pump, calmly chipped away the fresh ice, and performed this cold, almost sacred, purifying ancient ritual, keeping an expression of absolute, impenetrable calm, intense focus, and deep, unshakable inner peace on his face. For a Japanese soldier, maintaining physical purity was inextricably, deeply linked to spiritual purity. Being clean meant preserving his human dignity, preserving his true face, his immortal soul, and his sacred connection to his ancestors, even when he had lost absolutely everything, been stripped of his rank, and become a disenfranchised, nameless, freezing captive in a hostile foreign land where he was expected to break and die. But the burning, jaw-cramping, skin-cracking, ice-cold water in the dark, freezing mornings was far from the most terrible, enduring psychological test of their unbending collective spirit. After the end of the bloodiest, most destructive war in human history, the vast, deeply wounded, bleeding Soviet Union experienced colossal, unimaginable, catastrophic, nationwide difficulties in providing its massive, recovering population with basic, life-sustaining food. Villages destroyed to their very foundations, burnt to black ashes, heavily mined, empty fields overgrown with useless weeds, an acute, crippling shortage of working male hands left lying in unmarked mass graves on the battlefields. All this tragically led to an all-encompassing, total, gnawing, inescapable hunger becoming a constant, terrifying, invisible companion of every living person in this huge, struggling country. Absolutely everyone was starving, without exception. both ordinary, exhausted Soviet citizens, women and children heroically rebuilding their country from smoking black ruins, and the numerous, burdensome armies of foreign prisoners of war whose maintenance was a massive logistical nightmare. However, in this grim, hopeless, depressing picture of universal need, strict rationing and severe deficit, there was one highly interesting, deeply political culinary peculiarity which very few remember today. Japanese prisoners of war were supplied with food noticeably better, much more stably, and slightly more diversely than the captured, deeply hated soldiers of the German Wehrmacht. The policy of the highest Soviet leadership in Moscow in this specific logistical matter was extremely pragmatic, cold, calculating, and highly logical. The Japanese did not treacherously, violently attack the Soviet Union early on a summer morning in 1941. They did not burn entire ancient villages to the ground, along with innocent civilians locked in barns in the European part of the country. Therefore, in the distant Siberian correctional camps, they were treated more like a highly useful, disciplined, incredibly valuable labor force, essential for fulfilling the strict 5-year plans, rather than as sworn, unforgivable, ideological blood enemies deserving a painful, slow, vengeful death from total exhaustion. In addition to a slightly more generous, basic ration of black, heavy, damp, clay-like bread and rare, highly coveted fatty canned meat, which were handed out only on major state holidays to boost morale, the Japanese, according to official, stamped, mandated state norms, were additionally supposed to receive a whole 300 grams of pure, clean, white rice per person per day. Moreover, their specific, culturally adapted, unique ration officially included, at the highest ministerial level, the regular distribution of 60 grams of miso, a traditional Japanese thick, salty, pungent seasoning paste made from fermented soybeans, which was vitally, physiologically, and psychologically necessary for them to maintain normal digestion and preserve failing immunity in the completely alien, harsh, unforgiving, disease-prone Siberian climate. But the severe, unsightly, cruel, and chaotic reality of a snow-covered, isolated camp, cut off from the administrative center by hundreds of miles of impassable, frozen taiga, always dictated its own harsh, relentless, uncompromising rules of daily survival. Rice and meat in the first, most difficult, chaotic, hungry post-war years were literally in extreme, critical short supply across the entire nation. The national food warehouses were catastrophically empty and echoing. There was not even enough simple, low-grade feed wheat for baking standard edible bread for the locals, let alone importing expensive overseas Asian delicacies for prisoners. Most often, heavy, dusty, dirty sacks of coarse, unpeeled pearl barley, tough, difficult to digest barley, or cheap yellow millet were brought on horse-drawn sleds to the smoking, soot-smelling, freezing camp kitchen. Local Soviet cooks, sturdy, exhausted women who had never in their difficult, war-torn lives seen, tasted, or heard of the exquisite, visually stunning dishes of traditional Japanese cuisine, cooked the most ordinary, viscous, lumpy, heavy Soviet water porridge from this available cheap grain. This grey, absolutely tasteless, glue-like porridge slop, generously, heavily flavored with cheap, foul-smelling combined fat, or sometimes rancid fish oil, to superficially increase the necessary calorie count for workers, initially caused sincere, profound culinary bewilderment, physical disgust, and massive cultural shock among the Japanese, who had been accustomed since early childhood to perfectly fluffy, separate, individual grains of snow-white rice, fresh, salty seafood, and complex flavors. But the merciless, maddening, all-consuming, blinding hunger twisting their insides into painful, sharp, agonizing spasms after an exhausting, brutal 12-hour shift swinging heavy axes at the freezing logging site, always, invariably, and flawlessly took its absolute toll, violently overriding any refined cultural preferences. Yesterday's proud, elite, fastidious samurai, silently, without a single spoken word of complaint, indignation, or visible facial disgust, sat down at the long, rough, splintered wooden tables nailed together in the freezing, draughty, poorly lit dining hall, and ate absolutely everything given to them, to the very last drop, meticulously, carefully, scraping their dented, scratched, cold aluminum bowls with their spoons until they shone with a perfect, mirror-like gleam, leaving absolutely nothing behind, treating the terrible food with a quiet respect purely because it kept them alive. At the same time, the simple Soviet people working in the sweaty kitchen were immensely, genuinely, and constantly surprised by the strange, incomprehensible, and utterly alien manner in which the Japanese consumed their food. The prisoners never, under any circumstances, separated their given food into the liquid first course and thick second course that Europeans are deeply accustomed to eating sequentially. They completely, calmly, naturally, and methodically mixed the hot, empty, watery cabbage soup, the sticky, heavy grain porridge, and chunks of hard, sour black bread in one deep metal bowl, turning it all into a strange, homogeneous, visually unappetizing, thick gray mass. They then deftly, gracefully, and incredibly quickly ate it using homemade, thin wooden chopsticks, which they had carefully, patiently, artistically whittled with small, hidden pocket knives during long, dreary, dark winter evenings, sitting silently around the hot iron stove in the barracks. But the biggest, most visceral, unforgettable real shock for the local administration, the hardened, cynical guards, and the residents of neighboring, impoverished, starving settlements, was exactly how the Japanese inventively, boldly, and completely without any prejudice supplemented their meager, monotonous, vitamin-deficient government ration. Obeying their deepest primal instincts of survival and their rich, ancient national Asian traditions, which viewed nature as a vast, providing larder, they began purposefully organized, stealthy hunting for absolutely everything that moved, crawled, slithered, or jumped in the vast, wild Siberian taiga. Alexei Voronov once watched, with his eyes widened in extreme, almost disbelieving, stunned amazement, a striking, almost wild, primeval scene during a short, rare rest break at a remote logging site. He saw Japanese soldiers absolutely silently, moving like swift, deadly shadows with their bare, unprotected hands, catch a large, writhing, highly venomous, hissing snake in the thick, tall summer grass. In a matter of seconds, they masterfully, with chilling surgical precision, without unnecessary emotion, fear, or fuss, butchered it with a sharp pocket knife, cleanly and expertly removing the venom glands, baked the pale, lean meat over an open, crackling fire on a stick, and ate it with such an unruffled, highly satisfied, calm look, as if they were dining at an exquisite, expensive, multi-course dinner party in the capital of the empire. Without any shadow of European squeamishness, disgust, or hesitation, they waded deep into the freezing mud and caught slippery, croaking green frogs in the local, stagnant, mosquito-infested swamps, deftly skinning them alive with a flick of the wrist. They gathered large, fat green grasshoppers in the fields during the brief, fleeting summer, carefully dried them on hot, sun-baked stones to preserve them for the harsh winter, and consumed them as a highly valuable, life-saving source of pure, concentrated animal protein. For them, this was not madness or a sign of being feral. This was an absolutely normal, pragmatic way to survive, refined over centuries of isolated island living, a necessary, logical adaptation to preserve their rapidly melting physical strength for tomorrow's back-breaking, deadly labor. Hunger mercilessly, methodically, day by agonizing day, broke people, irretrievably erasing the thin, fragile psychological line between a civilized, rational human being and a wild, desperate, rabid animal ready to tear out a comrade's throat for a scrap of food. Alexei Voronov had repeatedly, with a heavy, burdened heart, seen how captured soldiers of other, once highly civilized, arrogant and proud European armies rapidly descended to the darkest, dirtiest, most pathetic, unimaginable bottom of human dignity under the crushing weight of starvation. They humiliatingly crawled in the freezing, filthy mud, begging for food, with tears streaming from their eyes from the already impoverished, starving, war-torn local residents while working on city construction sites. In their cold, overcrowded, smelly barracks, brutal, bloody, deadly fights with improvised shivs erupted every single night over a tiny, moldy piece of bread stolen from a sleeping, sick neighbor. Survival there inevitably, tragically turned into a vile, dirty, unprincipled, Darwinian struggle of all against all, survival of the most ruthless. But with the Japanese, absolutely everything was completely, fundamentally, philosophically, and culturally different. They amazed the entire camp administration, from the lowest uneducated guard to the highest commander, to the depths of their souls with their unshakable, stone-like, unbreakable, almost arrogant, silent self-respect. They were just as physically exhausted, just as starved, just as sick. Their faces resembled literal, walking skulls, tightly covered with yellow, translucent, bruised parchment skin, their eyes sunken deep into dark, hollow, lifeless sockets. But they practically never, under any, even the most terrible, desperate, life-threatening circumstances, humiliated themselves by outright, pathetic, vocal begging. Marching in a general, perfectly aligned, rhythmic formation past Soviet citizens, through the muddy, ruined streets of cities on their way to work, they always looked only straight ahead, proudly raising their bony chins, squaring their narrow shoulders, and never averting their gaze to look at the food held in people's hands. If some compassionate, grieving Russian woman, taking deep, motherly pity on an exhausted, freezing, ragged, dying young man who reminded her of her own lost son, secretly handed a young Japanese soldier a piece of sweet, warm, boiled beet or a crust of bread, he accepted this priceless, life-saving gift with a deep, ceremonial, deeply respectful bow, expressing the most sincere, wordless gratitude from the bottom of his heart, acknowledging her humanity. But he never, ever asked for it himself, by a single gesture, pleading look, or spoken sound. Inside their sleeping, Spartan, freezing barracks, the unwritten, unbreakable law of steel, ancient samurai discipline, always reigned supreme and unchallenged. Cases of sneaky, rat-like, cowardly theft of food from their own weakened, dying comrades were so incredibly rare that they instantly became a real, shocking, camp-wide emergency, followed strictly and immediately by a severe, merciless, silent court of honor held by their own commanding officers. After which, the guilty person forever became a total, invisible outcast, dead to his peers. Their thousand-year-old, unique culture of honor, simply physically and mentally, did not allow them to turn into base, hungry beasts, even while standing teetering on the very bleeding, dark edge of their own demise. Another real, mind-bending, paradigm-shifting revelation for the Soviet people, who were entirely used to the grim realities of forced labor, was their staggering, fanatical, almost obsessive, perfectionist work culture. As a universal, unwritten rule, any prisoners of war, regardless of nationality, try by hook or by crook, using any cunning tricks available, to avoid heavy, exhausting labor for the victorious enemy who holds them captive. Open, brazen sabotage, the intentional, stealthy breaking of expensive government tools, feigning illness, taking endless smoking breaks, and blatant, lazy, shoddy work. This is an invariable, classic, fully expected component of any forced slave labor system worldwide. But the Japanese became an absolutely inexplicable, phenomenal, shining, confounding exception to all the known rules of captivity here as well. Despite the penal, deadly conditions, the fierce, killing frost that cracked the trees, and the extremely meager, energy-deprived government food, they approached their forced work duties with a religious, fanatical conscientiousness, precision, and meticulousness. If the Japanese were tasked by the engineers with laying the brick, load-bearing walls of a destroyed, bombed-out factory being rebuilt from the ashes, or a large, multi-story residential building for Soviet workers, they did it with such incredible, focused, quiet reverence, as if they were erecting a sacred, eternal temple for their gods. They carefully, patiently, down to the last microscopic millimeter, measured every single corner using a simple builder's plumb line, regardless of the freezing wind tearing at their faces. They neatly, artistically, flawlessly smoothed out the mortar joints, not allowing for a single flaw, gap, or crooked line. When Soviet foremen, heavily driven by strict, unrealistic, punishing party plans, looming deadlines, and severe threats of losing their own bonuses or freedom, began to nervously shout, wave their arms wildly, and demand to immediately increase construction volumes at the expense of quality, the Japanese were sincerely, deeply, philosophically outraged. Hiroshi Tanaka, through a nervous, stuttering camp translator, politely but incredibly firmly, calmly, and categorically explained to the shouting Soviet leadership that senseless, fussy, chaotic haste fatally, irreversibly harmed the structural quality and soul of the work being done. For any self-respecting Japanese man, regardless of his current lowly status, doing his job crookedly, carelessly, or half-heartedly meant bringing an indelible, eternal, generational shame upon himself and his family name. They simply, on a deep genetic and cultural level, did not know how to do shoddy work, even while working entirely for free, as slaves for their conqueror. In their ancient, beautiful philosophy, any labor, no matter how menial or forced, was a direct, clear reflection of the master's inner soul. The architectural projects of the erected buildings, the complex blueprints, and the raw building materials were exclusively, entirely Soviet. But it was precisely by the calloused, frost-bitten, blood-blistered, tireless hands of these captive Japanese soldiers that the legendary, historically renowned reliability of these structures was brought to life. On the vast, sweeping, endless expanses of the Far East, in Khabarovsk, in Vladivostok, in Komsomolsk-on-Amur, monumental, sturdy, beautiful, solid buildings, built specifically by the precise hands of Japanese prisoners of war, still proudly, unshakably stand today, many decades later. Modern residents still live with great pleasure and comfort in these historical houses, invariably noting to this day their incredible structural strength, perfect, thick sound insulation, and amazing ability to preserve precious, life-saving warmth during the most severe, howling Siberian winters. The visual, daily appearance of these people in Soviet captivity was an entirely separate, amazing, fascinating, and sometimes highly paradoxical, almost comical story that captivated the locals. During the long, dark, deadly cold season, prisoners of war were issued en masse, standard issue, mismatched, extremely cheap clothing from the dusty, enormous Soviet military depots left over from the war. Walking along a frozen, snow-packed dirt road, one could very often encounter a completely surreal, striking picture, as if cut straight out of an avant-garde or fantastic, absurd movie. A Japanese soldier with distinct Asian features, marching in perfect time, dressed in a shabby, heavily patched, oversized grey Soviet padded jacket, tightly and neatly belted with a canvas army belt to keep the biting wind out, and wearing thick, clumsy quilted trousers. And proudly, squarely, almost defiantly perched on his head was a genuine, warm cloth red army hat with a distinctive pointed spike. But even this baggy, shapeless, extremely uncomfortable, heavy, culturally alien foreign clothing, they somehow incomprehensibly managed to wear with a special, innate, ineradicable, proud officer's bearing and military grace. They were always, without exception, neatly buttoned up to absolutely every last button, their belts aligned perfectly, and their old, faded, second-hand jackets were thoroughly, meticulously cleaned of mud, dust, and sticky tree sap, as much as was humanly possible under rough, primitive field conditions. They wore the rags of their captors like military dress uniforms, refusing to look defeated or broken. But during the short, fleeting, intensely long-awaited Siberian summer, when the deep snows finally melted, turning the ground to mud, and the suffocating, mosquito-filled heat set in, the Japanese career officers tried at all costs, despite all strict camp prohibitions and threats from the guards, to walk exclusively in their native, miraculously preserved imperial uniforms from the front lines. With scavenged thread by the dim light of the stove at night. And the most striking, unique thing, which forever burned into the collective memory and folklore of the local residents, they, en masse, almost to a man, wore geta. These are traditional, ancient, national Japanese sandals, consisting of a high, distinctive wooden sole, elevated on two teeth, with a simple cloth strap passing between the toes. They skillfully, patiently made them themselves, with their own hands, during long, dreary, exhausting evenings, carving them out of accidentally found wooden blocks, discarded scraps of building boards, and pieces of written-off heavy canvas or rags. And, on the long-awaited, rare day off, a clear, rhythmic, mesmerizing, and completely alien to these wild places, knocking of wooden soles echoed loudly along the dusty, uneven dirt roads of the camps. Clack, clack, clack. This dry, sharp, wooden sound resonated with a strange, hypnotic, almost musical echo among the native Russian white birches and dark coniferous pines. The captive Japanese walked unhurriedly with immense, quiet dignity, keeping their backs perfectly straight, looking proudly and thoughtfully into the distance, as if they were casually strolling along the blooming, peaceful, civilized streets of a springtime Tokyo rather than a penal colony. They carefully, with incredible, desperate love, preserved a tiny, tangible piece of their distant homeland in every single step they took on foreign soil. This deeply moving, profound documentary chronicle about 1 million Japanese soldiers who found themselves by the will of an evil historical fate in a completely foreign land, facing unbearable, burning cold, total, isolating despair, and the heaviest, most degrading slave labor, is a story that goes far, far beyond just the history of war and captivity. Hidden deep within it is the deepest, most important, timeless philosophical lesson for absolutely all of us. Living today in relative peace and comfort, this is a great, ringing lesson about how infinitely, crucially important it is, under any, even the most catastrophic, hopeless, degrading, and dead-end circumstances, to always, stubbornly, remain a true human being. To preserve one's true face and dignity, to boundlessly respect one's own labor and the labor of others, to strictly observe the purity of one's body and thoughts, not to sink to a base, animal state of mere survival, and never, under any circumstances, to betray one's deep spiritual, moral, and national roots. In the mid-1950s, after long, complex, drawn-out political negotiations at the highest state level, the Soviet Union officially began the massive, large-scale, long-awaited repatriation of the surviving Japanese back to their historical homeland. Heavy train echelons, belching thick black smoke, once again sounded their long, drawn-out, mournful whistles along the endless rails, carrying these significantly aged, deeply changed, hardened men back to the saving, warm ocean, back home, to their long-waiting, weeping families. Alexei Voronov, the now heavily gray-haired, deeply tired camp commander, stood silently on the snow-covered platform, the freezing wind whipping his coat, following the departing trains disappearing into the thick white fog with a long, unblinking, contemplative gaze. Hiroshi Tanaka, standing tall in the wide-open sliding doors of the departing boxcar, right before the heavy train started moving, found Alexei's face in the crowd with his dark, deep, unfathomable eyes. Not a single word was spoken between these two strong, war-torn men. They spoke different languages, and words were entirely, utterly unnecessary anyway. The Japanese officer simply, slowly, with an indescribable, innate, heartbreaking dignity, bowed his head in a traditional, deep, respectful samurai bow, paying a silent tribute of sincere respect to this harsh, icy, unforgiving country, and to the resilient, tough people with whom a cruel, historical fate had temporarily brought him together. Alexei Voronov, slowly pulling his bare hands out of the deep, warm pockets of his sheepskin coat, answered him with a short, firm, solemn, manly nod of his head. They had been irreconcilable, sworn blood enemies on the deadly battlefield. They had been a stern, powerful warden and a disenfranchised, vulnerable captive. But in the ultimate, historical end, they forever parted as two equal, strong human beings who had deeply understood, respected, and forever accepted the immense strength of each other's unbreakable spirit.